This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. This is episode number 187 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. My guest for today is John Lechner. John graduated from Georgetown University with a master's degree in foreign service. He speaks several languages, including Russian, French, Turkish, and Georgian. He now works as an independent journalist and reporting has been featured in the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, BBC, and many more. I invited John onto the podcast to discuss his new book, Death is Our Business, Russian Mercenaries and the New Era of Private War, which is available now. It's the story of the rise of the Wagner Group private military company in a few short years from just a handful of fighters to a combined arms force large enough to become a threat to the Russian government itself. But before we get into this story, you should know that OC Strategic Academy is here to teach you how to transform your career with the skill of a spy. With OC Strategic Academy, you can learn to understand people on a deeper level, influence decisions and build connections, and gain the edge you've been missing in work, in life, and in every interaction. Each course has been developed by a former war reporter turned human intelligence collector with extensive experience in the Middle East. The courses include Negotiate Like a Spy and Network Like a Spy, plus several others. There is also private one-on-one coaching available if you're interested in training that is tailored directly to your needs. You can find them at academy.ocstrategic.com and use the discount code SPYCRAFT101 to get 10% off any course you decide is right for you. Click the link in the show notes of this episode to level up your human intelligence skills. John, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. I'll admit, like I told you when we first started talking, that I've never really looked closely at Wagner Group before, so I was very grateful for the chance to read your book. It really opened my eyes to just what an incredible story all of this is.
Well, that's why I wanted to send it over to you. I mean, I think, this has been a big part of my life, following these Russian mercenaries and Wagner Group for at least the past 5 years. And so I'm very excited to be coming out with a book that sort of, like you said, tells the pretty incredible story of their trajectory and the private military company PMC's the trajectory of its founder, Yevgeny Prigozhin, from around 2014 to the mutiny and Prigozhin's demise just last year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just incredibly fast rise and fall, especially in the arc of history that I'd normally cover, which takes decades typically. But this was just here, and then suddenly it was everywhere, and then practically gone again. But nobody knows that better than you, of course. So I'm excited to dive into it. And I really enjoyed, you took a little bit of a different take than many of my authors do because you were actively investigating this story. So you kind of wind your personal journey into the book as well, which I really enjoyed.
Yeah, I felt that, I'm a big proponent of field work, a big proponent of, trying to interact with and actually interview the folks who are participants in the events in this history face to face. And so the book is, certainly kind of written as a piece of history and analysis, but it also, certainly includes my own experience working in especially the Central African Republic, where Wagner operated for many years and continues to operate, but also Mali, Libya, Syria, the front lines of Ukraine, Serbia, and elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. So that was actually going to be my next question. What was it that led you to write this book in the first place? But it sounds like you were already kind of treading some of the same territory as Wagner was. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, for me, first and foremost, as you kind of described in the introduction, my first passion is really languages and linguistics. And I love learning new languages. And I had spent a good amount of time living in Russia in the past, and I spoke Russian fluently. And I had been spending more time in Africa. And so when these Russian mercenaries first touched down in the Central African Republic in 2018, I was kind of immediately interested just on a more anthropological basis of what happens when these two very different societies, these very different communities come together, and how do they interact and how do they react to each other?
Yeah. It did sound so. It came across as like uncharted territory for them throughout the book. I found that very interesting because I know Russia has like a little bit of history in Africa, but it seemed like they were very much like breaking new ground in a lot of ways. So I'm looking forward to talking to that about that in the next few minutes here. And like I mentioned, you include your personal journey in there, and you seem to have been able to score a ton of interviews with a lot of the like the rank and file members
Mm-hmm.
of Wagner, and all of them. I mean, their stories were just very, very tense. Like these guys, I'm shocked that they're alive. Honestly, based on some of
Well,
the
some
stuff
of
that they
them
went
aren't.
through.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean, some of them are no longer alive.
right, totally. So,
Who are in the book? Yeah,
how did you like? How did you score all those interviews? Was it just like one connection leads to another slowly over time, something like that?
yeah, and I think the other thing that was important too was that I was always an independent writer and journalist and researcher, and I do think that had I been working for a major news outlet, it would have been very difficult to get any sort of access to the group. And so I was sort of able, and the reason for that is, I mean, a number of different things. But when you're working in sort of kind of for a as a journalist for kind of a mainstream outlet, or really any outlet where they're paying you every month, you're kind of expected to go to a place, write up the story, and then kind of move along to the next thing. And usually folks want to your editors will want to tie it to kind of a major event and make it kind of in some way sexy so that people click on it. And
Hmm.
what I had was I had the luxury of really working in a place like the Central African Republic, becoming an expert on the conflict itself. So that when I first started talking with the Russians who were there, I think initially they met with me because they were just intrigued that a fluent Russian speaker who's an American citizen is, in Bangui, Central African Republic, and wants to meet with them. But I was able to ask them kind of very specific questions about, what are you guys doing with, these rebels in this part of the country? How are you trying to integrate them into the military? How are you viewing, issues between these Muslim and Christian communities in this specific area? And so I think that they became over time a bit more interested in kind of in talking with me and talking about things that they actually found interesting in terms of all the challenges that they were facing in the country. And I didn't have to kind of go back to DC and immediately write up this big article about what Wagner's up to in
Mm-hmm.
the Central African Republic. And
Okay,
so over time, I was able, I guess, to kind of earn a degree of trust.
I see. I see. So did they, I don't know if I'd use the term let their guard down, did they embrace you a little bit more because you were putting in the time, or was it specifically or also because you were not affiliated with New York Times, so or another organization like that, or a combination of both perhaps?
I think a combination of both. I think what was crucial was that I always described them within the ecosystem, and you see it in the book too, that I always try to put their intervention within the greater context or the greater kind of ecosystem of the conflict, right? And so I would never just write about or analyze what Wagner was up to. I always looked at what Wagner was up to in relation as well to the Central African government, the armed groups that they're fighting against. And so I think they felt, at least, that I wasn't just there kind of to try and get a quick article about, ex human rights abuses, or, Wagner up, Russians up to some
Hmm.
nefarious thing. And that allowed a degree of opening up over time. Now, I mean, we shouldn't say, they weren't like, oh, here's how much is in our bank accounts, but,
Hmm.
but it did allow me to incorporate how they view the world, which I think is important and something that's kind of especially interesting for the book.
Okay, yeah, I totally understand that, and that's I'm glad you brought that up because that's another great point in the book's favor. It was for me, it was a real like primer on what is going on just the past few years in Central Africa, because that, quite frankly, is an area that I have not devoted a lot of time to reading about and researching lately. So I learned a ton about the actual situation and how fluid everything is there, since 2015, 2016, that time frame. So that was a great learning opportunity for me as well.
Yeah, and I think that was, to the degree that you can talk about, enjoying studying something along these lines. But I think that for me, at least intellectually, especially as I was writing this book, what was both challenging and intellectually fulfilling at the same time was that Wagner and how Wagner was operating was a window into these very complex conflicts. Some of the most major and most intractable conflicts that are continuing today, right? I
Mm.
mean, they initially were born out of the war in Donbass in eastern Ukraine in 2014. They were then a fundamental part of Russia's intervention in Syria before moving on to training and then participating in militarily in combat in Sudan, Central African Republic, Libya, Mali, and elsewhere. And so, these are some of the most kind of the biggest conflicts that the world is grappling with today. And Wagner was a participant in many of them.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. And I understand from the book, of course, that you yourself were arrested in Mali while you were researching this story. Can you talk about what happened there? Exactly what that experience was like?
Yeah, I disappeared in Mali while doing research. It was I disappeared into a black site. I was blindfolded and spirited away and questioned, interrogated, however you want to put it, for a couple of days at some black site before eventually being let go. I think it very much that incident. It's tough to know exactly why that happened, but I think at the very least it spoke to some of the very tense environments in which Wagner was operating, and in which covering these conflicts and can be difficult. The incident in Mali happened in 2023, and it became clear over time that initially I was thought that I was probably a spy, an American spy, and then over time, as I kind of slowly convinced them that I wasn't a spy, the questioning sort of shifted to, well, what were other Malians telling you? And this was a multiple coup within a coup environment. And so even kind of internally, not just what was going on in the countryside, where the Malian government, together with Wagner, is fighting against multiple jihadi armed groups, but even within the capital itself, the internal politics itself was incredibly tense, and I seem to have been an unfortunate victim of that when I was going around there at the time.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, it's hard for me to imagine a more tense situation, as an outsider, someone who's never even traveled to Africa, let alone been arrested for anything there. But it sounds like you came out of, I mean, well, did you come out of it no worse for wear then? I mean, I know that you clearly continued your research in the area and, it didn't keep you from your work, at least.
No, I think at a certain point it became clear to me that I was with the government, and I sort of knew that at least my physical security would likely be okay. But it became, I think, especially tough for my family at that time because as I mentioned, there's both an Al Qaeda affiliate armed jihadi group operates, and his has folks in the capital Bamako, as well as ISIS in the Greater Sahara as well. And so, and they do a lot of kidnapping. And so, for my family, it was especially difficult because they didn't know, and it was sort of assumed at the beginning that I was probably picked up by one of those two groups. And so, I think it can be difficult for. And in that type of scenario, it can be difficult for different folks, for different people at different times. And so, as I was kind of coming to terms with that, I would be kind of physically okay. My family was really going through a difficult time. And then they kind of, at a different point, they kind of knew more about my situation than I did, as I didn't know when I would actually get released.
Oh, wow. That's unusual and unexpected.
Yeah.
Hey,
Yeah.
well, glad you're here. Glad you made it through that, and glad that you continued writing as well. I say that as a consumer of your content already.
Well, I appreciate it. It makes it worth it. Yeah.
Yes. Great. So let's talk about Wagner. Can we go back to kind of the beginning of their story? Because like we did say, it's a relatively young organization, especially in terms of what I talk about here on the podcast. So just 11 years ago or so, 2014 was the origin of Wagner. Is that right?
Yeah, that's where we can put it. I think it's helpful to put sort of the context into which Wagner was born at that time. And so, first, if we look at Wagner's founder, a guy, Yevgeny Prigozhin, he was an ex-con, sort of a street thug in his teenage life, went away to prison, Soviet prison. And when he got out, a number of years later, the Soviet Union was collapsing. And he returned to his native St. Petersburg and became employed by some gangsters, got first into the grocery business, and then eventually opened up a number of restaurants that catered to the nouveau elite in Russia in the 90s and early 2000s. And then he eventually managed to leverage those relationships to a business as a contracting the meals for Russia's public schools and for the military. And so that's always where he really made a lot of his money. And as we know, kind of in 2013, the Maidan revolution is kicking off in Ukraine. And at a certain point, Vladimir Putin, who himself is just coming off of, pretty recent destabilizing protests against his return to the presidency at home, decides that with his inner circle decides that that Moscow will annex Crimea, which is where obviously the Black Sea Fleet was stationed, but also Putin is looking to kind of ramp up his nationalist credentials. There were a lot of right wing, a lot of nationalists who were marching against Putin in 2012. And those were the guys that he really kind of considered to be a threat to his rule. And so he really wanted to kind of co-opt that movement. And so the Kremlin turned, in order to annex Crimea, they turned to a number of kind of what we would call like patriotic volunteers, these guys from various Cossack organizations who kind of showed up and provided the muscle for protecting buildings and gave it kind of the vibe as well of kind of a popular local movement. But after the annexation, the Kremlin thought, this is all that we wanted to do. Those guys can go home. But the annexation of Crimea triggered as well responses in eastern Ukraine, in particular in Donbass, where a number of anti-Maidan protests were taking place, and where anti-Maidan protesters were taking over various administrative buildings, and basically believing that the Kremlin and the Russian troops were going to show up in eastern Ukraine just like they showed up in Crimea. But that really wasn't the plan. But their calls for kind of Russian support pulled in a lot of volunteers, these kind of same type of kind of Russian nationalist militants who are in Crimea to support them in Donbass. And these guys set off essentially the war in eastern Ukraine. And they put the Kremlin in a very difficult position because Putin and his cohort, they didn't want to annex eastern Ukraine. They didn't have any reason to capture Donbass at the time. They didn't want to be more internationally isolated. They didn't want a full-scale war at the time. But they couldn't be seen by the Russian public as sort of letting these pro-Russian supporters out to dry in eastern Ukraine. And so they turned to kind of these ad hoc covert methods to shore up the separatists in eastern Ukraine. And this provided an opportunity for sort of patriotic oligarchs like Yevgeny Prigozhin to kind of contribute to the cause through sponsoring some of these mercenary forces who were going over there originally. And that's how Prigozhin linked up with what became Wagner's commander, a guy Dmitry Utkin, in 2014 in Donbass.
Okay. That's just, to me, that's still like a kind of a shocking pivot because, as I think you mentioned a few minutes ago, Prigozhin's previous experience was running restaurants and contracting for school lunches. So for him to move from that to, low intensity conflict in Ukraine is incredible. So did he leave all of the training and tactics and everything to his partner, or did he get involved in the actual military side and not just the contracts and logistical side?
Oh no, he certainly left all of the. I think what Prigozhin was, he had a particular talent for logistics, lobbying, and connecting people. He had no military background whatsoever. Right. And so I think those things, were very much left to the number two guy, Dmitry Utkin, who had been a soldier, had fought in Chechnya, and was also a colonel, I think it was, in military intelligence, the GRU, before eventually retiring and joining a private military company called Wagner Group, right before he sort of co-founded Wagner with Prigozhin.
Okay. And did that, was it like a match made in heaven? Were they doing well right off the start, or was it like a bumpy road to kind of grow into the powerhouse that they became later?
It's a great question. We don't really know how they, so we still don't know actually who put them in touch. There are a number of different theories in terms of who connected them, probably someone in the GRU or, in kind of the St. Petersburg elite. Maybe there's a possibility that Prigozhin himself had kind of sought out and found this guy Utkin because he recognized an opportunity. But I think kind of we can say initially that they were kind of different types. Prigozhin, he's sort of had that gangster side to him, but he was also of Jewish descent, and Utkin was, for all intents and purposes, a neo-Nazi. Wagner was his call sign in Donbass because it was the Nazis' favorite composer. He had SS tattooed on his neck. And so they did make for sort of an unlikely pair, a neo-Nazi and a person of Jewish descent. Prigozhin eventually converted to Christianity, but he very much grew up in that environment, and the gangsters that he was initially hanging out with in St. Petersburg were Jewish gangsters as well.
Wow. Okay, yeah, this story just gets curiouser and curiouser as time goes by.
Yeah.
So if I recall correctly, the initial kind of deployment of their guys, like the first ones they actually sent into Donbass or Eastern Ukraine in general, it was like a platoon of guys, right? Like 40 or 50 guys was all that they could kind of muster right off the bat. And that's a far cry from what they grew to later on.
Yeah. I think they were, there was nothing at that time that pointed to what was to come in the future. And they were just some of many actors who were active and colorful characters who were active in Donbass at that time. And there are a few stories of some other various kind of militants and separatists who were fighting alongside Wagner, or, certainly kind of knew of them. There were a number of Serbs who had come over and volunteered to fight on behalf of the separatists. There were obviously a large number of Cossacks. There were a large number of just kind of normal Russian volunteers. And then there were these guys like Utkin, professionals who were there kind of apparently on contract. But initially, yeah, they were kind of spirited in order to shore up the separatist positions against kind of an increasingly confident Ukrainian military that, unlike in Crimea, very much wanted to retake Donbass from the separatists. But over time, they began to play a very different role, which we also kind of mentioned at the end of the episode in Ukraine, where over time, the Russian military itself began covertly intervening, sending men in without insignia, what became sort of the kind of famous little green men. Mm-hmm. And I think that was really, it was that force that really brought the Ukrainians to first the negotiating table for the Minsk I ceasefire, and then also eventually the Minsk II ceasefire. But the issue for the Kremlin at the time, as they kind of wanted to wind down the conflict, was that there were a number of separatist commanders, some of these local guys who had gone from, sort of nothing low lives to now like running this small fiefdom and kind of thrust into these important roles, a number of them didn't actually want to stop fighting. They wanted to keep going, to keep capturing more territory. They were against a ceasefire, and so Utkin's men got a new kind of order, which was actually to start assassinating some of these wayward separatists, so that
Oh,
the
wow.
Kremlin could take full control over what these de facto independent, or what they called independent territories in eastern Ukraine.
Wow. Wow. Tables turned very quickly, huh?
Very
Oh
quickly.
my gosh. My gosh. So was that a success? I mean, did the Kremlin ultimately get what they wanted during that phase, at least, or that period in eastern Ukraine?
I mean, it's difficult to say because they didn't really want to be there in the first
Hmm.
place. They sort of got dragged in, and then they had to find a way to, frame it as some sort of victory, which I think was difficult to do. They didn't really know what they wanted to do with those territories. But, as events continued to play out, I think they realized that they had to sort of take over, these quote unquote independent statelets in eastern Ukraine, at least to be managed. And I think over time too, eventually they realized that having this territory was another effective way to block Ukraine's NATO membership,
Yeah. Yeah.
to kind of interfere internally in Ukrainian affairs. But kind of as the book showed at the beginning, they didn't have, a lot of control over what was going on in that sort of revolutionary environment. And I think they were happy that they managed to eventually stabilize it in the end. And like we said, Wagner was helping to stabilize by, we have internal documentation from Wagner that they assassinated at least one separate Russian separatist leader. But I think it's fair to say that folks believe that they probably participated in a few more.
Okay. Okay. I've got you. I see. So, how quickly did Prigozhin and Wagner as a whole, how quickly did they start looking to other theaters? Because I know that they moved into Syria pretty quickly after things kind of, I don't know if I'd use the word stabilized, after things had died down a little bit in eastern Ukraine, at least. Like, what was the motivation there, and what did they end up doing in Syria?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the more interesting turning points, because it showed, and this will be a theme throughout the book, that Prigozhin himself had an incredible kind of entrepreneurial spirit. I think, he was the one who recognized, okay, I now kind of own this force, or I'm sponsoring this force. What can I do with it next that will earn me, money and prestige? And it was quite lucky for him, and I mean tied too, in a way, that as Donbass was winding down following the Minsk II ceasefire, or at least kind of stabilizing, the front lines had sort of stabilized, that Russia rather quickly then kind of intervened in Syria. And, I think most experts would agree that the reason kind of Russia intervened in Syria was not out of a particular love for Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian autocrat dictator who obviously recently has fled to Moscow, but because it was around this time that the U.S. itself had started ramping up its anti-ISIS campaign in Iraq and Syria, and Putin and Moscow were looking for a way to reopen diplomatic channels with the U.S. And by intervening in Syria and kind of participating in the anti-ISIS campaign by supporting Assad, they were kind of creating a fait accompli whereby the U.S. would have to kind of interact with them in a way. And I think
Hmm.
they initially envisioned sort of this grand, like, U.S. Russia anti-ISIS campaign that obviously never really, worked out for them. The Americans were, I mean, very much baffled when kind of Russia first intervened. But it's interesting to see how what happened in Ukraine very much affected decision making vis-a-vis Syria in Moscow. And for Prigozhin himself, he saw a new opportunity to insert his men into a conflict. But, as you see in the book, the first try was actually unsuccessful. They showed up and no one knew what to do with them, the Ministry of Defense. And so they were sent home. And it was only after a few months that both the Russians and the Syrians realized that they needed Russians on the ground if they were going to be successful against the various rebel groups that they were fighting.
Yeah, it seemed like a terribly confusing situation on the ground. I mean, many of these conflicts can be, of course. I'm kind of surprised. So they were not directed by the MOD to go to Syria in the first place? I mean, how did that originate exactly if the MOD didn't know how to utilize them once they were on the ground?
Yeah, I think it points to, and there are sources in the Ministry of Defense who think that it was really Prigozhin's initiative to get them in there, which would make sense or align with the fact that they were initially kicked out because no one knew what to do with them. But this is what was always interesting about Prigozhin, and something that you keep seeing later and later on is that he was an uncouth ex-con who had been rising through the ranks and always wanted to be within kind of the elite of the elite, like Putin's inner circle, the guys who knew Putin from childhood, right? And, therefore became the CEOs of, these vast state-owned and, or formerly kind of state-owned enterprises that, were worth hundreds of billions of dollars. But he was never allowed into sort of that, or kind of had a permanent status in that circle. He was just kind of outside of it, but he still had a personal connection to Putin. He could get in front of him, and when he had those moments, he could kind of lobby for himself. And so I think a lot of folks in Russia think that he likely managed to get the okay from Putin himself to send his guys into Syria, and then it was a question of Prigozhin making other people figure out how to do it. So obviously, he wasn't like, these are exactly the kind of bureaucratic things that would make people hate you, right? If you're in the MOD. And it's like, I try to make the analogy that, imagine you're the boss of the CEO's kid, right? So you're technically above them, but you know that the kid can go to the CEO at any time and complain about you. I mean, that's kind of the thorn in the side that I think he could be. But as luck would have it for him, it became clear relatively quickly, again, that Assad's forces were not up to task to take on much better motivated rebel groups. And so there was a need for Wagner. And what Wagner provided at that time was not this kind of plausible deniability, but something kind of much more basic, which was the fact that Moscow was aware that the Russian public didn't really understand the Syrian intervention, and they certainly wouldn't understand a lot of young Russians coming home in caskets. And so what made Wagner a good option at that time was the fact that they were technically contractors, mercenaries. And so those deaths and casualties don't have to be reported in any type of official statistic.
Right.
I mean, it's similar to the fact that, in Afghanistan, the U.S. lost, I think, twice as much contractors as they did actual soldiers, and it doesn't have to be reported.
Oh, wow. That's incredible.
I think they lost the same amount, so casualties would have been double.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, that's amazing. But it does make a very cold sort of logic, from a political perspective and current events kind of perspective. I get it, but it's still ultimately it's young Russian men, dying for some, nebulous kind of political objectives. But one, in one sense, is more palatable, and one is not.
Yeah, and I think from the Russian public's perspective, it's different if soldiers are being sent there versus someone who is kind of, as in the case in Wagner, signing up to go there for money, right? Gotcha. Feels like they know the risks of what they're getting into, and so it's more, those casualties are more tenable than a basic soldier.
So the second time that they went back, then did they prove themselves effective? I mean, were they punching above their weight once they were on the ground and working with Assad's forces? I mean, it seems like that was a tough alliance based on my reading of your book. Anyway, they had a really hard time keeping Assad's guys in line, it seems like.
Yeah, and my guess is that there was a lot of mutual hate feelings there as well. Unfortunately, it was tough to get the opinions at that time. I was doing all of this work while Assad was still very much in power, to get kind of their their views on working with the Russians, but at least with the Russian Wagner guys that I spoke with, they were very frustrated all the time in terms of that their Syrian partners would retreat very quickly, or just not show up, or kind of wouldn't really follow orders. And so there was a lot of frustration. But I mean, nonetheless, Wagner, along with other forces, and obviously the Iranians had provided proxies as well. There was Russian air support, but Wagner played a critical role in taking the very important capital, or not capital, but the very important city, Palmyra, from ISIS.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can certainly say that they did make a difference.
Okay, I see. And I know that, as you mentioned earlier, the U.S. involvement there on the ground led to some confusion, to say the least. But I understand there was also a very famous, like, full-on confrontation between Wagner and U.S. forces. Can you talk about how that happened and what the aftermath of that was?
Sure. So Wagner took Palmyra, or helped to take Palmyra in 2016, and again, they were effectively rotated or kicked out. There was a belief that there was no more need for these guys, and so again, they went back home. But again, a kind of a testament to Prigozhin's own tenacity and entrepreneurship. He was working on a deal with the Assad government itself to provide forces to take territory from ISIS, particularly the oil and gas fields, for a 25% cut of the proceeds from captured oil and gas assets. And so that was the incentive. They came back in. Palmyra was lost to ISIS. Again, ISIS retook it. And so again, Wagner was brought back in. And they launch their campaign. They retake Palmyra, and they start heading for the Euphrates River to the northeast. Meanwhile, the U.S.-backed Kurdish forces in the northeast are pursuing ISIS from the north, and it sort of becomes this race as ISIS is collapsing in 2017. There's basically a race between these Kurdish forces and Assad forces, backed by U.S. and Russia, to capture as many of the oil and gas assets as they can.
Mm-hmm.
And the Kurdish forces, the SDF, they take kind of the biggest asset, which is the old Conoco facilities, which is just on the other side of the Euphrates River. And we know that Prigozhin very much was racing to get there. He wanted those assets. They were worth, a couple $100 million. And we also, at least from one letter, know that Prigozhin was having difficulty, or at least complaining about that he wasn't getting paid properly by the Assad government for all of the assets that he was taking. And so, as he complained in the letter, he was actually kind of a couple $100 million in debt from the campaign. And so we don't know for sure, but I think that sort of sets up a good line of reasoning about why Prigozhin thought that he could take a risk to try and to take these Conoco fields. And in early 2018, he decides to do just that. There was a deconfliction line between Russia-backed and U.S.-backed forces along the Euphrates. The Wagner crosses the Euphrates. They start heading towards Conoco, where there are U.S. special forces. And the U.S. calls over the confliction line to the Russian MOD several times, and the Russian MOD says, no, it's not our guys. It's not our guys. And finally, after the third call, with Wagner attacking this base where U.S. forces are, the U.S. calls in full air support. I mean, basically, the amount of firepower that they put on it far exceeded the threat that was there, and it was to send a very clear message. And so, around 70 Wagner fighters died, 70 Wagner mercenaries died. I think about 30, if I remember correctly, Syrians fighting with Wagner at that time, and then a large number of injured afterwards. But it was a very serious routing for Wagner, and it sent a message. No Wagner force crossed that deconfliction line after that.
That's incredible that they would be so brazen with American forces nearby. Was it like a fog of war kind of thing, or were they trying to like call the bluff by U.S. forces on the ground? You think like, no, they won't do anything?
It was a call the bluff.
Call the bluff. Okay, so
Yeah,
it did not work out.
I think so. I mean, they knew that the Americans were there. I think that Prigozhin, well, first of all, I mean, he was, he was comfortable taking risks with other people's lives. So, you have that.
Hmm.
I think he probably thought that the Americans would see this force coming and that they would just retreat.
Okay.
And he was wrong.
Man, cost a lot of lives. There's certainly, I know that story's gotten quite a lot of play since then as well, but at least that was the last time that it occurred for them. So was that kind of the closing of the Syria chapter at that point, or did they stay on for quite some more time?
Yeah, they stayed there, but always kind of guarding assets and training things along those lines. Maybe some kind of sporadic fighting here and there, but again, like sort of that line pretty much stabilized for quite some time until what we quite spectacularly saw just last year in December when the Assad regime collapsed.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, that one
Because
took me
I
by
was in
surprise.
northeast Syria in October, and we were going around kind of in that area, and it was really kind of the same line. The major shifts have been happening with Turkey's kind of subsequent interventions into Syria, but within kind of Assad territory, things hadn't shifted until everything came down very quickly.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, I was surprised at how quickly that fell apart, even as a kind of an uninformed outside observer, as I was at the time.
You didn't. I mean, uninformed. I mean, most people who were informed did not expect that.
Well, okay. Dang. So expect the unexpected, I suppose.
Yeah.
Of course, you mentioned at the beginning, quite a bit of activity in Africa. So did that come after Syria, or was he branching out in multiple regions at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, the outreach into Africa first began, I would say, in 2016, 2017. So sort of around the same time, but they first touched down in Sudan as part of a deal to provide military instruction to the leader Bashir's security forces, and in exchange they were granted kind of privileged access into the gold trade. And Prigozhin first became interested in that in around 2016, and the deal was signed in late 2017, which is around when they touched down both in Sudan, and then also kind of quickly thereafter they touched down in the Central African Republic as well.
Hmm.
And they were also active in providing kind of political consulting services in Madagascar around that time in 2018. And so I mean, it started with Sudan, but again, very quickly, Prigozhin, had put together a team of, I guess, they would call themselves kind of Africa experts who were looking at new opportunities, new business opportunities in Africa. And so, yeah, I think at that time, there was like a rush of activity of looking where they could potentially insert themselves commercially or with their various services or training. And I think there was a list of around like 20 countries. Obviously not all of them worked out, and we saw that kind of relatively quickly. Central African Republic, Madagascar, Sudan were kind of the first.
Man, he's a guy with just seemingly unlimited ambition.
Yeah, I mean, he's, I don't think it's, it's not something that we should, over exoticize either, right? I mean, we live in a very capitalist society, right?
Hmm.
Where, like, what should you do if you've made $1 billion is you should try to make another $1 billion,
Right,
right?
right, of course.
And Prigozhin was, he was a guy, I think, who, I mean, he obviously enjoyed money and power, but he was very much, I think, motivated by the deal itself and going after kind of bigger and bigger deals.
Hmm.
He really seemed to enjoy the thrill of putting these things together.
Hmm. So, what do we know? Is it known what his ultimate goals were? Like, did he just see the company expanding throughout the world and becoming like a $1 trillion enterprise at some point? I mean, any idea what the kind of the limits of what he wanted for Wagner were?
It's a great question. I don't know if he ever saw limits for himself, but I think, again, if we go back to, I think how he envisioned himself was kind of at the very, inner circle of the Russian elite, where in effect you become kind of untouchable, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you no longer have to answer for your mistakes. And he never got to really that point where and we point out this out in the book, right? Wagner, we described all of the various campaigns that Wagner was involved in Syria, and the amount that Prigozhin himself had invested in it. And when a couple of kind of choice assets companies are up for grabs for the Russians in Syria, it ends up going to another oligarch, Gennady Timchenko, who is one of Putin's, longtime best friends, right? And so for Prigozhin, that's incredibly frustrating, right?
Mm-hmm.
That, here I am, in his mind, putting blood, sweat, and tears into all of these, projects to further, the Russian state or Putin's government, and he's not getting, in his mind, fairly rewarded for it. And so I think there was that chip on the shoulder too, that he was going to kind of overcome all of his rivals and get to that point where he is his own man in a way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have the hindsight of 2020 now. Of course, this seems like just tremendous foreshadowing for what was to come. A guy who's perpetually on the outside and is extremely ambitious and has like this ever growing, ever more capable combined arms force that really only answers to him. I mean, we know how the story ends, but did anybody foresee, you think, what was going to happen, in 2023?
It's a good question. No, I don't think I think, and this goes back to Africa, each intervention, especially in Africa, was very different. And to a certain extent, all of the various kind of, Central African Republic was a very interesting case, right? Because they first showed up and were engaged in military training. Prigozhin was offering, his consulting services. They were getting paid in mining concessions, which is not really favorable to them, right? Because they have to put all the money in to actually kind of benefit, from those concessions, or exploit those concessions. But he starts expanding into vodka, a brewery in the Central African Republic, all sorts of businesses. He's able to do that because there's no other real kind of competing Russian institutions in the Central African Republic. There's no other kind of rivals to keep him in check. And so in Bangui, Prigozhin kind of becomes the Russian state. Like we see when he's given kind of absolute freedom, he expands into whatever he sees as an opportunity, right? But that wasn't the case in all of these places. We already kind of talked about, what was happening in Syria, right, where they got kicked out a number of times. There were all sorts of competing institutions, and that's reflective of the fact that Syria was much more important to the Russian state more generally than the Central African Republic, right? And so in these areas that were not very important, Prigozhin has kind of a wide leash to kind of pursue things as he sees fit. And I think he really, kind of enjoyed that ability in Africa. But when the full scale invasion of Ukraine starts in February 2022, that's where the real, from the perspective of Russian politics, that is what's important, right? That's where you have to have your guys in there. Right? That's the most important thing to Putin and the Russian state, and that's where the real money is too, right? And so I think he had become somewhat used to kind of being his own operator, or kind of a big fish in a small pond in Africa, where Russia's kind of state footprint is significantly lighter. But then once he was back in Ukraine with his force, he was, once again facing these constraints, while I think, his ego had had somehow gotten even bigger kind of in the meantime.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, that's a very long way of answering that. I don't think that too many folks were concerned about what was going on in the Kremlin in the Central African Republic, and that he, was, if anything, there were, some scandals with the human rights abuses and some annoying things that they had to deal with, but it wasn't kind of a major domestic concern. I think that only really occurred after the full scale invasion in Ukraine.
Right, right. That was a very different ballgame, of course, in the eyes of the world. Are there how many people was Wagner able to put into the fight in Ukraine? I mean, were they pulling people out of Africa and everywhere in order to make that like their main effort right from the start?
Yeah, they pulled guys out of each place, but they very much kind of left enough contractors behind in CAR, Central African Republic, in Mali, where they were, even in Libya as well. But they still pulled a number of kind of talented commanders out of Africa to join in what Putin called the special military operation in Ukraine. And then they also started taking in a huge amount of volunteers. And then, obviously, quite infamously, they began recruiting from Russian prisons.
Yeah, yeah.
Offering, a 6-month contract where if you serve and you survive, you get a clean record and are, essentially not going back to prison. And once he's bringing in prisoners, I mean, the ranks of Wagner obviously explode to, I think estimates are around, that Wagner probably had 50,000 prisoners, Russian prisoners, serve in its ranks.
My gosh.
Probably about half of them died. But, I mean, we're talking much bigger numbers.
Wow. Wow. Okay. I did not realize it was that many, or honestly, that the casualty rate had been so high. I do recall, however, I believe that you were able to interview at least one of the prisoners turned mercenaries. And I think I recall correctly, he said something like, yes, we knew that it was going to be extremely dangerous. They were very upfront with us about that. But of course, I'm willing to take, a 6-month dangerous tour in order to get out of, years of my life spent in prison. Right. Was that more or less what the guy told you?
Yeah. I mean, I interviewed a number of these guys, 2 of them while I was in Ukraine, one of whom now is fighting on behalf of Ukraine.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was that. I think that was very interesting because, again, there were so many narratives that you come with these preconceived narratives, right? And I think what I was initially kind of ready for was for me to come in to interview these guys and kind of think about, I was coming from a vantage point of like, oh, these guys are being exploited, right? They're being taken advantage of. They're
Mm-hmm.
in some kind of very macabre way. They're victims of Prigozhin, right? And then you're interviewing them and they're like, no, we know. Like, we know. And they felt like they were taking advantage of Prigozhin. Like, this was a good deal.
Oh, well.
And they felt that he had adequately explained the risks. I mean, I think as I thought about it more, I mean, I think we also have to understand that think about kind of the filtering process that's going on, right? So you're getting these guys who are in for assault, murder, theft, kind of these various violent crimes. They are not usually the folks who are kind of predisposed to, like, thinking incredibly long term about their future. And then, you know, they were very much in the minority of people in the prison who signed up to join Wagner, right? So you're getting kind of the most rash out of the most rash
Mm-hmm.
of people or impulsive people who are kind of signing up for this. And I talked to a number of guys and they were just like, yeah, I didn't even read the contract. I just signed it. I mean, like, and even one guy who I was sitting in front of, I was like, also thinking like, oh, this guy has like 20 years, right? And he's like, better than 20 years in a Russian prison. Like, he had served 3 out of 4 years.
Oh my
and,
gosh.
and it's like, you would have been out. Like, like,
My God.
why would you do it? And I mean, part of that too is sort of the prison culture. Like, it's in the book, right? But like the thought that one of them, like his, lesson for me at the end was, there's nothing worse than being a coward. There's I'm sure you could dive into all of the imperiled masculinity that's going on in that kind of
Mm-hmm.
environment as well, and the need to be seen as courageous and impulsive and dangerous and what
Mm-hmm.
have you. But yeah, no, it was fascinating, that mindset that these guys brought. And they weren't necessarily victims of perversion. I'm sure some of them were very much taken advantage of, or maybe as they process it later on, they see some things. But that was not my experience in interviewing them.
Mm-hmm. So it seems to me that these guys were pretty clearly expendable, both by the Russian government, who would allow them out to go to the front lines, and by Prigozhin himself. So did they prove their worth? I mean, was this a smart move on Wagner's part, or did these guys just get like chewed up on the front lines and then replaced again?
Well, they got chewed up, but and we can go into it. I mean, they did. It's a useful tactic, right? Human waves. If you have an endless supply of
Mm-hmm.
men, and this isn't really me. I'm not a military expert, but folks who I respect would say that the Ukrainian leadership made a mistake by deciding to stick it out and fight in Bakhmut, which was an area where they we're not at a kind of geographic advantage, where Prigozhin was sending these human waves, and where, obviously, the ratios of, Ukrainians to Russians, being casualties was obviously heavily in the Ukrainians' favor, but they were losing some of their most talented guys
Mm-hmm.
and women, right? And from the Russian perspective, like you said, these guys were more expendable. But I don't think that we should be humble enough to recognize that the guys who survived those 6 months and the guys who decided to keep fighting are not to be taken lightly, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a self-selecting process too, and so a number of the guys who, if you survived for long enough, these guys started out as prisoners, but they're pretty effective fighters by the end of that, right? And so they rise up through the ranks as well. And now at this point, I mean, they know better how to fight in a modern day total war than vast majority of our soldiers, right?
Yeah, certainly they've been through the gristmill, no question about it.
Yeah.
So, John, we talked earlier about this widening rift between Prigozhin and Russian government, really maybe just the MOD specifically, and there's an enormous difference between being upset with decisions being made at higher headquarters, which has probably happened in every war ever, versus an actual full-on mutiny, which we now know is what happened. So, what was the catalyst that led from Wagner to basically turn around and head east towards Moscow, which just kind of took the entire world by shock, I think? I mean, there must have been something specific besides, the things that we've already mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, so again, I think the way that we can think about it is that Prigozhin was operating in an environment where, especially after kind of COVID and after the war started, he no longer really had direct access to Putin, right? And so, we talk about it in the book, but Putin is kind of a famous germaphobe, and so you have to isolate for 3 weeks, quarantine before going and seeing him. He's not seeing a lot of people, not even his friends, right? And so this means that Prigozhin's enemies within the administration are also able to block his access,
Mm-hmm.
Putin as well. And Prigozhin's operating in an environment whereby he's not making it any easier for himself, but he also has to kind of deliver these victories to stay on Putin's radar, right? So he says he's going to take Bakhmut. He has to take Bakhmut. At the same time, his rivals in the MOD first cut him off, and this is probably the most important thing, is they cut him off of the ability to recruit those prisoners, right? And that was the strategy,
Yeah.
the human wave strategy, right? And so all of a sudden he doesn't have as many bodies, and he's getting squeezed on all sides. And so he eventually, as I write in the book, he's not, strictly within the Ministry of Defense, so he can play that to his advantage. And the way that he does is through social media. And so, these Telegram military bloggers and, Wagner channels had taken off with the full scale invasion. And Wagner became this kind of, very kind of cool nationalist brand that the Kremlin had to lean on, to bring more young men to the front. And so Prigozhin leaned on it, and he went kind of the populist route. And he was out there on the very close to the front lines, much closer than the Minister of Defense was willing to go, seemingly giving kind of real reports about how things were going, right? And he starts targeting the MOD on social media. And I think this is also especially when his international celebrity just goes through the roof, right? I mean, he's on CNN, not speaking, but CNN is covering him every day, right? He's at New York Times asking for comment. I mean, the whole world knows who Prigozhin is, right? And so his ego is also kind of going through the roof.
Yeah.
But meanwhile, the MOD basically has this plan that they want to cut Prigozhin off and then kind of take over all of his guys. And I think really it was that moment where the MOD kind of puts forward the proposal that all fighters have to sign a contract with the MOD, that Prigozhin realizes that he no longer will have these guys under his command, right? And if you don't have those guys under your command, you also no longer have the political power, right? I think he kind of saw for himself a future that was at best kind of fading into obscurity, which for him was also probably untenable given kind of where his ego was at the moment. And so, he keeps on looking at ways to raise the stakes to get in front of Putin. Eventually he raises the stakes enough that he's basically marching on Moscow.
My gosh. It's unthinkable until it actually happens, I guess.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's difficult to know what was exactly kind of going on in the Kremlin at the time, but I've spoken to at least one participant in that march, and they were adamant that the task that they were given, was obviously not to overthrow Putin, but to kill the Minister of Defense, the Russian Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu. And I don't know exactly what the logic was at that point, but I guess, again, it's raising the stakes, creating these fait accompli. I suppose that perhaps in Prigozhin's mind, you take out Shoigu, then there's no longer, the Minister of Defense, then there's no longer, any option for Putin but to either make him Minister of Defense or to let Wagner continue to be kind of this semi-independent structure or kind of an independent structure that answers directly to Putin.
Yeah, just wild stuff, truly. Was there any pushback from the hierarchy within Wagner about this? Like, hey, maybe we should not be marching on Moscow, because that seems like something that only Prigozhin would think could work out, I would imagine.
I think we don't know the exact composition, but I think there was kind of one guy who's a managing director who seems to have not participated, which was why, it seemed for a while that he would have a place, especially in kind of the post-Wagner structures. But within the Council of Commanders kind of itself, the important commanders, we don't know exactly. It seems like a number of them were on board and participated, but the vast majority of the guys who participated on the ground were those prisoner recruits who, it could be said, had kind of a particular loyalty to Prigozhin, right? He was the guy that got them out, giving them a clean record and treating them oddly, to a certain extent like equals, right? And that they were treated as equals within the organization, even though they were, also treated as cannon fodder. So I think he had in particular their loyalty, but, I've talked to a number of other Wagner fighters who were horrified by what was happening, that they were turning against. And they thought that Prigozhin had completely lost the plot, right? And they absolutely didn't see themselves as traitors that would ever turn on Russia itself. So opinions varied across the board.
Okay. Yeah, just just wild to think about all the conversations that must have happened and the predictions and all of that. It turned out ultimately to be a very, very short-lived mutiny or short-lived mutiny. Anyway, why is that? Why did he change his mind? Or, I mean, did cooler heads prevail, or was it that he recognized that there was no way this was going to work, or what exactly?
Probably some combination of all of that. Unfortunately, he's not around for us to ask any longer, so it's difficult to tell. The leader of Belarus, Lukashenko, played a role, it seems, in negotiating it and getting Prigozhin to back down. I think they were kind of surprised as well that the extent to which they were kind of traveling into open space. I think at a certain point, events kind of went beyond anybody's control, and these guys were going down the highway to Moscow and not meeting resistance. And, the only thing you can keep doing is going forward, right? But, there certainly felt like if they reached Moscow, there was going to be some sort of crossing the Rubicon, right?
Yeah,
that I don't think anyone particularly had the stomach for. And ironically, as some people would say, Prigozhin, this was the one time that Prigozhin should have doubled down, right? Because, as they say, right, if you go for the king, you best not miss, right?
Yep.
But he backed down, and as we saw, it led to his demise a few months later.
Mm-hmm. So what happened to Wagner as a whole after that? Were they disarmed? I mean, were they reorganized or sold off, or what exactly?
It's been a different process in each place. I mean, they all now, to varying degrees are affiliated with the Ministry of Defense, but within the Ukraine campaign, the various kind of guys have gone off to different other units and under different commanders or different some under the National Guard, some joining kind of other kind of volunteer battalions, these types of things, kind of semi-private structures. For Africa, it was more difficult, especially in the Central African Republic, because it was really a place that only the Wagner guys understood and only understood what they were up to. And so actually there really wasn't like a significant replacement, and still hasn't been to this day. Whereas in some other places like Libya, there was kind of a handover to these kind of alternative structures now called Africa Corps. And in Mali, there's been sort of kind of a half handover between Wagner and Africa Corps that really hasn't been going that well because of issues of terms of command and control, and who's responsible for what, which is in part how up to 100 Wagner guys were ambushed and killed in northern Mali by Tuareg separatists a few months ago. So it really depends on the environment in which they were operating.
Okay, I see. So a lot of different things happening there. And since we mentioned,
it's like fixing a plane in the air, right? And so in some places where Wagner is still very much operating in a conflict and a participant in a conflict, it's very tough to like just take those guys out and replace them all, right?
Oh yeah.
And so you kind of see these kind of like patchwork ad hoc efforts to do so, but it's no easy task.
Gotcha. So, and Prigozhin, of course, you mentioned he died. I understand it was like his plane exploded in flight, basically,
yes.
Which happens all the time. Obviously.
Happens all the time.
Yeah. So you probably remember just a few days ago, last week, I shared that photo on Instagram of Prigozhin at the dinner with Putin and George Bush back in 2006. I immediately got several questions from some of my followers of whether or not I thought that Prigozhin actually died or not. So is there any doubt in your mind, or are there any serious evidence to the contrary that he was on that plane, or do you think he is definitively dead and done for?
I think he's dead and done for.
Okay.
Yeah. I think it's fairly definitive.
Okay. Is there any? Do you have any idea why people would think that he was not dead? I have not looked into it that closely, really.
I mean, for the same reason that maybe people think Elvis isn't dead, right? And you think there's, maybe there's a certain desire to believe that this was all some sort of conspiracy, but I think the truth is often far scarier, right? Which hopefully the book shows us, that the Kremlin isn't always in control, right, of what's going on. And Prigozhin's mutiny was very much a testament to that fact. And, what he did was, at least in Putin's eyes, unforgivable, and he had to be punished for it. I think it's very unlikely, that was some sort of clever thing, ruse, and that he's alive somewhere. He's very well known. We would have seen him probably pop up somewhere, and he's not the type of person, as we described, who would be able to go quietly,
Yeah,
and just live in retirement in some cabin in Siberia. And I think that the fact that we haven't actually heard from him, that there's no press conference or anything along those lines, is probably the best evidence that was killed in that plane crash.
Yeah, very convincing on its own. No doubt about it. Okay, wow. Well, fascinating stuff, John. I really appreciate it. It's an incredible story, just a fast-paced story, much more so than a lot that we cover here, certainly. And I really appreciate you writing the book. For those of you who want to read a lot more about all of this story, much more than we can cover in just an hour and a half or so, the book is called Death is Our Business by John Lechner. We will link it up in the show notes of this episode as well. And John, now that the book is published, are you moving on to another project? Is there anything else in the works that you can tell us about?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would love to. It was kind of tangentially covered in the book, but as we know, we talked about a number of these different conflicts in which proxy forces are operating, and so I think I would love to write another book about the evolution of proxy warfare from the end of the Cold War up until today. So for any of the listeners out there who were participating in Central America or operating during the War on Terror, please reach out.
Okay, yeah, I have a feeling some of those people are going to hear this episode, quite frankly. So
that's what I figured too.
Yeah, no doubt. I've definitely talked to a few of the Cold War era guys, but I have not really covered post Cold War era yet, because a lot of those guys are not really willing to speak publicly, but they might certainly be willing to go, anonymous or semi-anonymous with you. You never know.
A lot of folks spoke anonymously for this book, as you can tell.
Yeah, totally. Fascinating stuff. Well, thank you so much, John. Do you have like a website or social media profiles you want to direct people to if they want to follow along your story after they hear this?
Yeah, of course. You can find my Twitter is John Lechner1. My Instagram is John A. Lechner. You can also reach me on my website. My email is there, johnlechnerauthor.com.
Awesome. Okay, yeah, we'll link those up in the show notes as well. John, I really appreciate your time. This is a great talk, and I look forward to that book on proxy wars once you have it out. So please keep me in the loop on that.
Thank you, sir.
All right, thank you.
Again.
Take care. If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my page on Instagram at Spycraft 101. You can also find more great articles on my website, spycraft101.com. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there's lots more to come.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The stories and statements expressed herein are experiences and opinions. They may not reflect the views of the host or the production studio. It's okay if you disagree with our content. No piece of media is right for everyone. If you love Spycraft 101, please check us out online, on Instagram, on YouTube, and especially on Patreon. Thank you for listening.